often wonder what is going on in people's minds.
The power of language. Language shapes people, cultures, relationships, and a lot of other important aspects of humanity. It connects us. How we talk to each other defines us as humans and separates us from other species on this lovely planet. Language is our primary tool for expression and communication. There are more than 7,000 different languages in the world. Learning a new language can open completely new worlds for us. Chomsky once said we have a profound understanding of grammar and it makes learning new languages easy for us. This is why we want to introduce the following study to you. Broca's area and the language instinct. Before we do that, let's have a quick look at Chomsky's universal grammar again. He thought that the reason why children were able to learn a new language without any effort was that the human's innate ability to acquire new grammar. Since all babies are born the same, but learn so many different languages, Chomsky figured that there had to be general laws or grammars that every language follows, and he called them universal grammar. Should it exist, it would also suggest that there is a predetermined brain system containing this universal grammar that underlies our acquisition of a new language. But let's see if you could choose the grammatically right sentence of a language you never learned. Japanese. Just by following your inner grammatical instinct. Both sentences are supposed to mean Paul eats the pear. So now please read the sentences and decide for yourself. We will give you a few seconds. The first one is right. Did you guess correctly? If not, don't worry. Our version was of course just a very simplified one of the actual study that we're going to present to you now. Finally. In our study, Broca's area and the language instinct, they tested this universal grammar theory with not only Japanese but also Italian and tried to figure out the brain's role in learning a new linguistic competence. Some of the real, others artificially, so made up. Their hypothesis was, when postulating an epigenetic role of the brain system in language learning, the acquisition of linguistic competence should involve this, earlier mentioned, brain system, only when the new language is based on the principles of UG. Otherwise it should depend on others. In our study here were only 12 participants for Italian and 11 for Japanese. All were German native speakers and had no prior knowledge about their tested language or any similar one. But in order to avoid confounding syntactic rule acquisition with the word learning, and therefore only test rules or grammar that lies behind our language, the participants received a list containing all the words used in the experimental task to learn them by heart. In the experimental task, they were confronted with 3 real grammatical rules and 3 artificial ones. They had to learn them by heart and were tested on them. It followed this procedure. During an activation task, they read 6 sentences in the real and unreal language and judged their syntactic correctness while their brains were scanned by fMRI. They indicated their answers by button presses with the left middle finger for correct and with the left index finger for incorrect ones. In between each session, they had a 3-minute training pause where they learned real and unreal grammatical rules, each for 1 minute with several examples which they judged for their correctness and got feedback whether their judgment was correct. But now let's have a quick look at these rules they had to learn, starting with the real Italian ones. The first rule concerned the so-called null subject parameter. In German, the subject is obligatorily and overtly expressed, whereas in Italian it is not. In passive construction, the object becomes the subject. And the third rule is about subcoordinate declarative constructions. Italian maintains the same subject-verb-object order, so SVO, as in the main clause phrase. In contrast, German typically uses the SVO order. If you want, you can pause the video and have a closer look at the table above that presents examples and German equivalents to the rules. The Unreal language used as a control task in the experiment is not totally artificial, but resulted in both languages from selective manipulation of already existing rules. The artificial Italian rules were, for one, negative construction, where they put the word no always after the third word of a phrase. Then integrative construction that inverted the linear sequence of the words of a sentence, and lastly the use of indefinite articles that always agree with the last noun of the phrase. Moving on to the real Japanese rules. The first one concerns the main clause construction. While Germans use SVO, Japanese use SOV. The second and third grammatical rules concern the same structures as in the Italian experiment: passive constructions and subcoordinate clauses. Consider passive constructions first. Unlike German and Italian, Japanese does not use modal verbs, but rather passive suffix riru on the verb. Furthermore, Japanese has various options for the subcoordinate clause. The last set of rules and the artificial Japanese rules were similar to the artificial Italian rules. First, we have negative construction, where they put the negation nai always after the third word in the linear sequence of words in all sentences. Then integrative construction, which inverted the order of single words. And at last past tense construction, where the past tense was built by adding the suffix ta on the second word, continuing from the right to the left in all sentences. Like I mentioned before, during the activation task, the participants were lying in an fMRI scanner to test differences in the brain activity between acquisition of real and unreal grammar. This device was used to study the function of the brain and not so much its architecture. It is able to do that by measuring the bold or hemodynamic response. This means that it looks at the blood oxygen level under the premise that higher oxygen means that the particular brain region is more active and needs more oxygen. With SPM99, they pre-processed the fMRI pictures and then used the t-test and ANOVA for statistical analysis, which was done for every individual, but also the group as a whole. After the statistical analysis from 8 subjects in each experiment, they obtained equally high accuracy of around 95% at the end of the experiment in all syntactic tasks. The learning curve for both real and unreal condition were not linear. In the third session of the Japanese experiment, there was an inflection in performance on the real versus unreal grammatical tasks. Furthermore, there was no significant difference in performance across sessions between real and unreal language learning tasks. The reaction time of pressing the button to indicate the correctness of a sentence was measured and showed a significant reduction with concomitant improvement in accuracy of the answer. It was also very important to show the difference that came with learning the real or unreal task. The grammatical judgments during the real grammatical learning task were faster than during the unreal ones. But let's move on from the behavioral results to the imaging ones. The main effect of performing the classification task was an activation in widely distributed areas, including prefrontal, parietal, anterior cingulate and occipital cortex. They used random effects model to identify the activation pattern specific to the interaction between change in blood oxygen level, dependent signal, and type of rule learning, and found no specific pattern for unreal grammatical acquisition. But they saw that an increase in bold signal in Broca's area correlated with the increase in accuracy during the acquisition of natural rules. They found a positive correlation between bold signal and accuracy in the real grammatical task, a negative correlation between parameter estimates and learning unreal rules. Moreover, the fMRI pictures showed a significant increase in bold signal parallel to improvement in performance in 2 parts of the right inferior frontal gyrus, anterior to the precentral sulcus and also in left lingual gyrus. The conjunction analysis showed activation in left cingulate, right insular, right supramarginal gyrus, and left cerebellum. And lastly, the correlation coefficient for the group between parameter estimates in right inferior frontal gyrus and accuracy within sessions showed a significant positive correlation between bold signal and accuracy of performance of real and unreal task. So to sum up the probably overwhelming results I just presented to you, yes, the hypothesis is true. We seem to have a brain system that only reacts to languages that are based on the principles of universal grammar, the Broca's area. This area only showed an increase in activation when the participants learned the real grammatical rules. Let's evaluate. Although this article seems to prove the existence of a universal grammar, we have to take into consideration that only 23 participants took part in the study and only 18 were included in the data analysis. Also, most of them were very young and so probably still able to acquire new knowledge relatively easy. Adding to this criticism, one could also argue that fMRI tends to only yield very general results. But let's bring our critique to another level and approach the idea of a universal language on a logical basis. First of all, there's the argument that language is very diverse and varies in content and form, which would mean that there has to be at least some plasticity and learning ability to adapt to that. Also, there is a constant change that even reaches the fundamentals of languages of the centuries due to phylogenetic and geographical influences. And this dual role of biological and cultural historical attractors underlines the need for a co-evolutionary model of human language, where there is interaction between entities of completely different orders, biological constraints, and cultural historical traditions. As a last point, I'd like to mention that human language is a recent phenomenon, approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years old, which hints that human language most use pre-existing brain machinery. But what does the existence or non-existence of universal grammar ultimately mean? If it exists, we, as humans, have something that sets us biologically apart from other apes, other than the cognitive ability of higher problem solving. Maybe it means that we have an intuitive desire to communicate. It would explain why we speak our native language without actually knowing the rules, and that two languages who seem to be completely structurally different still have their basis in common. And what if it does not exist? Well, that just means that we have a few things more we still cannot explain, and that we, at least for now, have to live with the fact that it seems like we just acquire language like every other knowledge.
Is God responsible when my neighbor's acting all insane? Or should I blame it on his culture? The genes are firing in his brain. Do I experience snow?
Thank you for watching.
Eskimo does, or is my language shaping up all my perceptions and thoughts? The only one answer I can find: go study cognitive science.